Hello, hello, welcome back to Loki's Librarian. If you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina, and I do a book review a week, mixing up a cocktail while I review it. It's called Books and Booze. This week's book is Gun Barons, The Weapons That Transformed America and the Men Who Invented Them, by John Bainbridge Jr. I hope I'm saying his name correctly and not too British. The accompanying cocktail comes from another book. It comes from this one, Cowboy Cocktails, 60 Recipes Inspired by the American West, by Andre Darlington. I'm mixing up a bone orchard. Bone orchard is a metaphor for graveyard, much as I love guns, even after the absolutely appalling attempt made on former President Trump last night, which is, I mean, guys, if you wanted to guarantee his landslide election in November, well done. That's all I'm saying. Well done. You did it. But as much as I love firearms, they have contributed to a lot of bone orchards since their inception. It's disingenuous to pretend otherwise, just in wars alone. Anyways, let's do this. I didn't tell you guys what the recipe was, did I? The accompanying cocktail is a bone orchard, right? It is 1.5 ounces of Bonded Applejack, 1.5 ounces of Sweet Vermouth, 3/4 ounce Campari, an orange twist, and an apple slice for garnish. Now let's do this. Okay. I didn't have Bonded Applejack. I could only find blended, so I had to go with blended on this one. That's okay. There's probably not too much of a difference, I hope. So this book opens by introducing a cast of characters. And the introduction is literally just a, almost like a family tree, if you will, of firearms. And we start with Samuel Colt and Eliphalet Remington. I'm probably mispronouncing that name. Remington, I got it. It's the Eliphalet that I'm stumbling over. They both basically stand alone. So does Christopher Spencer at the other end of the tree. But in the middle of it, we have, Oliver Winchester. But to get to him, you got to go through Walter Hunt, who initially invented the Volition repeater rifle, the patents of which were purchased by Lewis Jennings, who wanted to improve on the design and eventually created a volcanic repeater with the help of Horace Smith. Horace Smith, of course, later was joined by Wesson for Smith & Wesson. Edwin Wesson was the older brother of Daniel Wesson. Daniel is the one who joined Smith. They both worked for Jennings on the volcanic repeater, the volcanic repeating arms company, which would later be purchased by Oliver Winchester. Benjamin Tyler Harry would work for Winchester, and while working for Winchester, create the famous Henry repeating rifle. Edwin Wesson was that older brother. He was the master gunsmith who actually trained Daniel Baird Wesson, who would, of course, pair up with Horace Smith. And then their major technological breakthrough came when they purchased the patent for the bore-through cylinder from Rollin White. And those were the basic cast of character that was outlined at the beginning of the book. Got it? Good. Now, the search for the repeating firearms was on pretty early, and while the Volition repeater was an early rifle version of a repeater, meaning able to fire more than one shot without having to reload it, it was buggy as hell. It never quite worked right, which is partly why Walter Hunt sold his patent early on to Lewis Jennings. The other part being it costs money. I mean, it's one thing to have the idea. It's an entirely different thing to actually make that idea a reality. And when you don't have the money for it, all you can do is sell the idea you had to somebody who does have the money to make it happen. I have to eyeball this one. It's approximately 3/4 ounce. Sure, why not? This is a stirred cocktail, so let me stir this up. So the fact that Walter Hunt was able to make any kind of a repeating firearm basically meant that, yes, it's very possible. And that possibility led to the designs of everyone else, basically. Oh, mother F. All right. Left the knife downstairs. I was going to bring a knife with me. This is not the best knife for this, and I'm absolutely going to have to wash my blade now, but whatever. There we go. You and you. Well, that's tasty. So Colt creates the next repeating firearm. And I mean, it wasn't a rifle. But again, the possibility, since Walter Hunt proved it was possible, Colt moved his entire product line being focused around handguns, not rifles. But Colt did invent and patent the first revolving cylinder pistol. And he I think, initially patented it in England, believe it or not, because if he had patented it in the United States first, that might have interfered with England or something like that. But I'm not sure if that was in the... It was in the book that he went to the Crystal Palace, which was basically a World Expo held in London in the 1830s. And his revolver was big news there, and he came over here and was patented it and designed it and sold quite a few of them to the Texas Rangers. All right. The thing with Colt's product line is it was a revolving cylinder pistol, but this was before copper case cartridges were a thing. So the original Colt pistols were also muzzle loaders. You would just revolve the cylinder to load the next round. But then the speed was produced when you didn't have to stop to reload after every shot. You could actually fire 7 shots in a row. I think it was a 7-shot pistol. And that was a game changer in early Texas before the Mexican-American War, when the Texans were fighting the Comanche, specifically Samuel Walker, Texas Ranger, the very original Walker, Texas Ranger. The Campari adds a bite, which Campari is a bitter. It's a form of bitter, and it's supposed to add a little bit of a bite. It's not bad, though. Now, Walker, Texas Ranger, I'm just going to call him that, he swore by the Colt, and he pushed for the Republic of Texas and later the U.S. Army to buy them in bulk, which was done, and left Colt with the problem of needing to manufacture them. Now, Colt had the patent as of 1835. Like, that was in his pocket. He had that. And patents were good for 10 years. You could apply for a patent extension, which he did, which effectively gave him a 20-year monopoly on rotating cylinder firearms, which we call revolvers. Okay? And that patent ended up expiring in 1857. He aggressively protected that patent, suing everybody successfully for patent violations, including Smith & Wesson. Now, those two bided their time and waited for Rollin White. Okay, they didn't know they were waiting for Rollin White. They just knew that someday they would have their revenge in the courts for Colt having basically wiped out their first business, the volcanic repeating arms. And it was Colt's lawsuit that resulted in the volcanic repeating arms being purchased by Winchester and rebranded the New Haven Repeating Arms Company. Rollin White at this time was a machinist, and he was actually working in that capacity for Colt when he started trying to figure out how to make a cylinder that would load through the breech instead of the muzzle. And he figured out the pass-through cylinder and how to make it work. I mean, it wasn't the most stable, and basically the only one who thought it would work and was a good idea was Rollin White. But he did figure out that pass-through cylinder and how to make that functional, and it was that feature of his patent that Smith & Wesson licensed from him. They didn't buy it, they licensed from him. And they did something that it's not even a little bit shitty, it's a massive shit thing to do. They licensed the patent from White and agreed to pay him a royalty for each firearm sold. However, White then had to defend that patent against violation. So if anybody else tried to make his patent, he couldn't license it to anybody else. He could only license it to Smith & Wesson, but Smith & Wesson wouldn't pay to protect that patent, which meant all the royalty checks that came in for their sales of the firearms using his patent design, he basically lost trying to defend that patent. And in his contract, he had to defend the patent. He couldn't just say, oh, well, I'm going to let them do it. So, and he would come to resent that clause immensely, and I don't blame him. That's a shit deal. And he won every single patent suit, but he still had to pay the lawyers' fees to file them. Now, where Smith & Wesson would really reap their rewards was when the all-in-one cartridge, aka what we would recognize as a modern bullet, was invented. This was not invented by an American. It might surprise people to learn that, but it was invented by Louis Nicolas Auguste Flaubert in Paris. Isn't that a French name? His original rimfire cartridges did not have a lot of powder or power to them. He meant them basically be used as single shot in parlor games, literally parlor games. All right, not like taking aim and shooting at people, but like target shooting in a parlor. Freaking weirdos. Smith & Wesson figured out how to take this idea, and they created a new 22 caliber rimfire cartridge to go with their new 7-shot revolver, which began production in 1857. And I mean, the very second that Colt's patent on the revolving cylinder ended, they were in production. And Colt did fail to secure a second extension on his patent. I think he applied to Congress for it, and they're like, no, you've had 20 years. We're going to see what other people can do with it now. Remington Now, the Remington family were not actually directly firearms makers to start with. At least not while Eliphalet, they called him like Flip or something like that. It was something, not while the Remington patriarch of the clan was alive. They were machinists, and they produced everything from rifle barrels. Yes, they actually were known to make very fine rifle barrels, but they didn't make the firearms directly. But they made plowshares. Anything mechanical, anything that required a machinist, they would make. And that family power lasted until the Civil War and the expiration of Colt's patent on the revolver design, at which point Remington started to basically make knockoff pistols. And I don't want to say that derogatively, because I think Remington's a pretty solid brand, but they basically were just like, yep, here's our pistol, and we can make it as good as anybody else, and it just nightmare. Remington's big contribution to the firearms industry would happen a decade after the Civil War with their rolling block rifle, which was a favorite of big game hunters. It was a 50 caliber 45 grain cartridge, and it was very stable. It was a well-known marksman's rifle. I feel like I want to say Teddy Roosevelt enjoyed it. Like, there's marketing literature from very big name people talking about how fantastic the rolling block is, and it's a single shot rifle. I actually have one. It's clearly an antique. It's like an 1876 rolling block. Spencer's sole contribution to the firearms industry was a big one, and there's no arguing this. His was the favorite rifle of Union troops during the Civil War. So important was the Spencer repeating rifle that the Union troops, if they believed they were dead, dying, or about to be overrun, would disable the rifle in such a way that it could not be used against Union troops by Confederate soldiers. And they probably didn't need to go that far out, but they would like pull important pins and throw them very far away, which would disable the rifle. But really, the thing with the repeating rifles is, unless you had the ammunition to go with it, you didn't have anything to shoot, because a lot of the Confederacy was still fighting with muzzleloaders. And that's like, let me think here. Do I have a good comparison on hand? Well, I mean, that would be like trying to fire a Spencer repeating rifle against an AR-15. I mean, there's just, the advances in technology are loads above each other. They're not equal by any metric. But for 7 glorious years, because it started just before the Civil War, Spencer rifles were the absolute best. And Spencer got huge chunks of the Union contract during the Civil War, with the remaining advanced riflery being billeted out to the Henry repeating rifle from Winchester Arms. Now, I am not going to go into the bad blood between Henry and Winchester, because I went over that quite a bit when I reviewed Captive of the Labyrinth back in October last year. But Rollin White, in his attempt to undercut his very bad patent contract with Smith & Wesson, had a second patent nearly identical to his first, and obviously changed just enough that he was able to get a second patent. But that one, he didn't even tell Smith & Wesson about. They certainly didn't license it from him. And he had that lined up and ready to go as kind of an end run around the patent licenses agreement with Smith & Wesson. He had no intention of extending his patent request on the bore-through cylinder because of how badly Smith & Wesson had screwed him. And they tried to get him to do it, and he's like, no, if you want to retalk the contract, I'll consider it, but I am done defending patent suits on your behalf. You do it. And I get it. I mean, he literally lost everything he earned from the royalties, so the only thing he got was that flat sum for licensing in the first place. It was a shit deal. He got a raw deal from Smith & Wesson. Long-standing rivalry between Colt and Smith & Wesson did not die with Samuel Colt. He passed away on January 10th, 1862. He was only 47 years old. The manufacturing continued well after his death. I mean, it's even still going on today. But both Colt and Smith & Wesson produced high-powered revolvers for the military, for the Indian Wars out west, basically. And Smith & Wesson at this point shot itself in the foot, metaphorically speaking. They had worked their revolvers so that they could fire both Colt cartridges and Smith & Wesson, but Colt did not reciprocate that, which meant that if a unit in the field had Colt revolvers, but only Smith & Wesson ammunition, they had nothing to shoot. And I think they thought they were being clever with saying, well, hey, but we could shoot both. Go ahead and buy all the Smith & Wesson because you could still use your Colt ammo. But gun people are loyalists, right? They find a brand they like and they stick with it. And Colt had already had the military contracts for 20 years, going back to the Mexican-American War. So they kind of shot themselves there, metaphorically speaking. And then he rounds out the book, and obviously this is, like I said, a very quick recap. He did round out the book with some footnotes on how people ended up. So you had Walter Hunt, who created the first Volition repeating rifle. He was a consistent inventor throughout the life. The Volition repeater was just one of his patents. But as soon as he would patent an idea, he would sell it, basically to keep money coming in to feed his family. And he was right at the brink of full financial solvency. He had invented a sewing machine and was all set to sell the patent to one Isaac Singer, which, you guys, if you sew or know somebody who sews, you recognize the name Singer Sewing Machine. He was going to sell that patent for $50,000, which would have been like $1.4 million in today's currency, when he died at 62. And his co-creator, I think, reaped all the benefits, none for his widow. Rollin White also kept inventing. He patented many inventions also in the textile industry, which is where he got his start. He died on December 16th, 1890. He was 74 years old. Benjamin Tyler Henry kept inventing, but he moved into vehicles. He invented an axle box for vehicles. Died on June 8th, 1898 at 77. His name lives on the very active Henry firearms. You can still buy them. They make modern weaponry based off of his classic design. They're still making lever action rifles, which are absolutely iconic. I mean, if you watch any Western movie, you're going to see a lever action rifle, and that would go back to Henry's design. Samuel Colt's factory kept on keeping on until May 2021, when the Colt name was purchased by, and I'm going to mispronounce this, is the Česká Zbrojovka Group SE, based in the Czech Republic. The Remington name still exists. It still makes Remington firearms, still here in the USA, at I think the original factory in Vermont? I think Vermont. I don't know. The Remington family has not been a part of the Remington brand since the 1880s, but the people who purchased the brand recognized that you don't fuck with name recognition, and they just kept the Remington name. They closed very briefly in 2020 after a bankruptcy restructuring. They reopened in May of 2021, and they are again kicking out some very quality firearms. Smith & Wesson was eventually also purchased by the same group that purchased Colt. Their purchase actually happened first. They were bought in 2005. Spencer did keep inventing guns, but never reached the level of success he did with the Spencer repeating rifle, although he did invent a repeating shotgun in the 1880s. He also invented an early automobile that was coal-powered and acted as a dual thing to manufacture the parts for the repeating rifles. That's kind of impressive. He died at 88, but not after he had a chance to fly in a plane that was invented by his son. So his son was also an inventor. This book, it's a good introductory primer for anybody who wants a general overview of some of the great names and inventors of modern weaponry, and it is modern. Even Colt's original muzzle-loading revolver advanced the general footprint of semi-automatic weaponry. So I would even call that modern. I mean, muzzleloader is antique by these metrics, right? But it's been 200 years since that one was invented. But it was still, like I said, it advanced the general footprint. This is where everything springs off. But it is a general primer. I mean, if you want to know details about any particular brand or inventor, there are books dedicated to each of these men. And so pick who you want to learn about. This is a good starting spot, but there are more detailed books out there. This book wove each of these narratives together, but it did not always flow smoothly. Some of the transitions were definitely clunky. But overall, I enjoyed it. It had lots of good history. It covered the corporate tensions that drive innovation in any industry and all of the backstabby, high drama that comes from patent law, basically, which you wouldn't think of, but it's certainly there. And patent law is part of the lifeblood of America, believe it or not. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys next Sunday. Bye.